Hi, all. The reason we're having this class about the war on drugs is obviously that's not a formal part of constitutional law. But given that constitutional law is shaped by the history of the times in which it is, from Reconstruction to the Warren Court to the war on drugs, which shaped how people discussed, talked about, and decided exceptions to the Constitution. To understand the war on drugs, it's worth understanding that it was very much a political movement to raise it as an issue, to make the politics of it matter. Yes, drugs mattered, there was a rise in drug use, but it's worth remembering, as the text notes in Michelle Alexander, that in October 1982, less than 2% of the American public viewed drugs as the most important issue. Yet, as Ronald Reagan and others raised it as an issue, put money out there to say we need to actually take this more seriously. Suddenly, by 1986, Newsweek was declaring crack to be the biggest story since Vietnam. Time magazine declared it the issue of the year. Thousands of stories about the crack crisis were there. And in 1986 and then 1988, the Congress passed massive versions of legislation increasing the death penalty for drug related crimes, authorizing the admission of illegally obtained evidence in drug trials. Most of all, it increased mandatory minimums, first for the distribution of cocaine, then more severe punishments for the distribution of crack, creating the notorious differences on punishment between crack and powder. And in 1988, there was a whole new range of civil forfeiture around drug crimes and a whole range of new expanded death penalties. And for the first time, you could have a 5-year mandatory minimum for simple possession of cocaine base. It's worth noting that before this had all started, until 1988, 1 year of imprisonment had been the maximum for possession of any drug. And suddenly you could go to jail for 5 times as much just for simple possession. You know, in the late 1980s, you had this whole issue of politics playing out in the politics, and many swing voters were targeted, especially by the Republican Party, as seeing this as a way to make inroads. And one thing Michelle Alexander does is put this in the context of saying, when you had the rise of Jim Crow, and it's worth remembering, black voters didn't lose their vote instantly. There was a whole period between 1876 and complete formal disenfranchisement, which happened more around 1900. There was even some alliances between whites and blacks, a sort of new fighting for around the populism to actually overcome some of the racial divisions, similarly to what Alexander argues was happening in the 60s and 70s. And the drug war, like Jim Crow, became a way to break any alliances between poor whites and poor blacks. And so you had, coming into the 1990s, numbers that had never been seen before. One-fourth of young African American men under the control of the criminal justice system, in jail, waiting trial, in prison, or on parole, some in some way under the control of the system. And in 1994, another crime bill happened under Democratic President Bill Clinton. Some of it was, new money for social programs, but you also had new federal capital crimes, mandated life sentences for 3-time offenders, and a whole range of new tough on crime policies, money going out to the states to actually encourage more and more focus on drug offenses. One of the things that is laid out in by Michelle Alexander is that there were very few legal rules that ended up constraining the police during the war on drugs. The Supreme Court seemed to seize every opportunity to facilitate the drug war, primarily by finding exceptions to the Fourth Amendment on searches and seizures. And, People even talked about an almost virtual drug exception to the Bill of Rights. And within a few years after the drug war was declared, most legal scholars had seen a very sharp turn in the Supreme Court's Fourth Amendment jurisprudence. You know, some examples that were laid out, mandatory drug testing of employees and students were allowed. You could allow random sweeps of public schools, expanded government wiretapping authority, helicopter surveillance over homes without a warrant, and expanded forfeiture of cash, homes, and other property, often on unproven allegations of illegal drug activity. There was a sign that the Supreme Court would allow the Fourth Amendment would not allow it to interfere with the prosecution. We looked at Drayton, but even before that, you had Florida v. Bostic, where if somebody agrees to have their baggage searched by police, say on a bus where they feel somewhat trapped, that was still considered okay. Even if you feel uncomfortable, they use this idea of the reasonable person. And the idea, as people often felt, is you may not feel like so comfortable saying to an officer, no, please don't search my bag. This idea of so called consent searches became the massive hole in the Fourth Amendment. So, since if a police officer stops somebody in their car, wants to search on when they're on a bus, as long as they agree to the search, everything's okay. You know, pretext stops with a car, whatever reason you're pulled over, it often encourages people to allow people to look around the car for fear that they might get arrested. Thinking back to Atwater, for example. You know, pretext stops, consent searches, all of these added up to not only increased punishments, but because of the discretion involved, allowed greater versions of discrimination in how these rules were applied. And because you often could find drugs that would not have been found otherwise, increase the amount of punishment for various drug crimes. Now, one thing to note in all of this, even where their officers were frustrated by a motorist's refusal to grant quoting consent, the Supreme Court allowed them to bring drug sniffing dogs around somebody's vehicle, saying that didn't constitute a search. There was a whole range of different exceptions that went through. But one of the things that you have to ask is, why did the police focus on drug crimes? And the interesting answer is a lot of officers didn't want to initially. At the beginning of the 1980s, most police didn't see going after drugs as the typical part. Yeah, they had a narcotics division, but that wasn't what most cops did. But because Congress started pumping money out, primarily through what was called the Edward Byrne Memorial State and Local Law Enforcement Assistance Program, essentially departments, cities had great incentives to have drug busts. Essentially, they estimated that for every drug arrest, they would get a certain amount of funding. I think at one point it was estimated to be about $153 for every arrest, with no similar payments for homicides or any other kind of particular crime, getting government money on such an individual per punishment case. And of course, there was civil forfeiture. The fact that police departments could seize assets and have additional resources made it that much more attractive. And in 1984, Congress had amended the law to allow federal law enforcement agencies to retain and use all proceeds from assets forfeiture, and to allow state and local police agencies to retain up to 80% of the asset's value, a pretty big incentive to move forward on the drug war. And the interesting thing is, unlike punishments for yourself being convicted, where you had to be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt, asset forfeitures, the burden of proof for the police to hold on to it was far lower. It was sort of a preponderance of the evidence. And even though there were some reforms on it, protecting girlfriends, other partners, what was called the innocent owner's defense, civil forfeiture still was a broad incentive to drive the drug war forward. And, you know, understanding the discrimination involved, I mean, Human Rights Watch, an international human rights organization, 2000, highlighted the fact that African Americans often constituted 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison. This was a massive disproportion, given that every survey showed that whites and blacks were using drugs at roughly similar rates. You know, and here's the other thing is while mass incarceration was exploding in this period, violent crime, while it had increased, was not increasing at anywhere similar to the rate. And we read the piece about, oh yes, most of the people arrested weren't for drug crimes, although many of the drug crimes would have people cycling through. But the war on drugs helped drive an overall sense of we need to increase penalties, we need to increase the mandatory minimums. So every crime got higher mandatory prison minimums, and so all crimes helped fill the courthouse, fill the prisons, and people were not leaving because they were in for so long. And here's one of the other things. It was very hard with drug law enforcement. If somebody calls the police with a drug crime, nobody's usually looking into it saying, oh, hey, I was ripped off in the drug deal. It actually encourages discretion. People are only caught if the police go off and get involved. And because it is an initiated investigation, the bias by police, the bias by prosecutors, bias turning into racial bias became even more a driving force. And gave you the example of US v. Drayton, just as an example case, sort of building on the case of Florida v. Boston. This is one where the bus was essentially taken over by a crew of police saying, we want to search. And, while Justice Kennedy noted officers made sure not to block the aisles and the officer at the front of the bus was not intimidating or coercive, but Justice Souter, notably appointed by a Republican president, basically mocked this, saying, look, people don't agree to be searched for their own safety. They find police intimidating. Officers had taken control of the bus. Nobody knew exactly what the scope of their authority is. And, it's worth keeping in mind that in this whole period, you saw this rise and rise of mass incarceration. And even as, if you going by the statistics, and even given the last year of a bit of hype over a rise in crime is still down over 80% from where it was in the early 1990s. Yet, while prison imprisonments have dropped a bit, we still have masses of people who were put in under mandatory minimums or who are only slowly dribbling out of the system. So we have a legacy of mass incarceration due to this history that is quite stunning and we'll be dealing with probably for decades. So, anyways, that was the class for today, and look forward to seeing all your responses on it.